In the heart of the celestial data core network, where the accumulated memory of 18 galactic cycles was etched into the crystalline lattice of a billion stars, archivist Kale Voss began the work of erasure. The core was no mere archive, it was the substrate of reality itself. Every coordinate, every temporal signature, every quantum imprint of existence, whether a fledgling world or an empire of 1,000 suns, was stored in the immutable web of stellar data nodes. To delete was to unmake, to purge was to render something not merely forgotten, but as if it had never been. Kale Voss was a Vorseth, a lineage engineered for the solemn task of archival fidelity. His form was sleek and angular, a lattice of obsidian scales over a frame of articulated alloy, his consciousness distributed across neural filaments that allowed him to interface directly with the core's vast mnemonic arrays. He had spent 3 cycles maintaining the sanctity of the network, pruning obsolete records, reconciling dissonant histories, and ensuring the galaxy's narrative remained coherent. Erasure was a rare duty, reserved for existential threats, civilizations that had breached the protocols of containment, seeding recursive anomalies that threatened the stability of the lattice itself. Humanity had been such a breach. The verdict had come from the conclave of preservers, a consortium of data wardens spanning the spiral arms. Human expansion had been marked by a cascade of irregularities, improbable victories against superior armadas, cultural memoplexes that propagated through ideological resonance rather than computational dominance, and a stubborn persistence that defied predictive modeling. Their final transgression was the War of the Veil, in which a coalition of human vessels, outnumbered, outgunned, and severed from all supply lines, had detonated a series of null-point generators, creating temporary fractures in the core's referential framework. Billions of records across multiple sectors had unraveled, leaving voids that the lattice struggled to reconcile. The conclave's decree was unequivocal. All traces of Sol system, its astrometric coordinates, its historical imprints, its ancillary data signatures were to be comprehensively expunged. Earth and its colonies were to be excised from the universe's memory. Kale accepted the assignment without protest. Duty required precision, not sentiment. He entered the primary deletion chamber, a vast spherical vault suspended at the nexus of the core's primary data streams. The walls pulsed with the faint luminescence of active lattice threads, each a conduit for the galaxy's encoded reality. At the chamber's center hung the erasure matrix, a polyhedral construct of refractive crystal, its facets capable of isolating and nullifying any specified datum. He began with the simplest task, the coordinate registry. The stellar cartography of Sol was a modest cluster, 48 primary bodies, with Earth at its rotational anchor. Kale interfaced with the matrix, threading his consciousness into the lattice. The data presented itself as a holographic manifold, a 3-dimensional skein of navigational vectors and positional harmonics. Sol's imprint was unremarkable in scope, a faint nexus amid the blazing hierarchies of greater systems. Initiating excision protocol, he intoned to the chamber's log. His voice, a modulated cascade of harmonic frequencies, echoed briefly in the sterile confines. The deletion proceeded flawlessly. The matrix isolated the coordinate block, severed its referential linkages, and collapsed the quantum signatures into null entropy. The manifold adjusted seamlessly, smoothing over the absence as if a minor transcription error had been corrected. Sol's system vanished from every navigational array, every astrometric survey, every predictive model. To the galaxy's data substrate, Earth had never existed. Kale withdrew from the interface, his filaments retracting with a faint crystalline chime. The task was complete, or so protocol demanded he believe. Yet as he initiated the verification sweep, a standard diagnostic to confirm the excision's stability, a discrepancy registered. The coordinate block was gone, but in the empty space it had occupied, a faint topological ripple persisted. It was not a residual echo, not a fragmentary data ghost. It was a reformation. The lattice, in attempting to normalize the void, was spontaneously reconstructing the deleted vectors. Not precisely as they had been, no. The new coordinates were offset by infinitesimal margins, as if refracted through a subtly altered medium. But the structure was unmistakable, a star system, centered on a G-type primary with an iron-rich terrestrial body in its habitable zone. Kale paused, his primary cognitive array cycling through possible explanations. Data percolation from an unsevered ancillary cache. A subroutine error in the matrix's nullification heuristics. He ran a recursive analysis, isolating the affected sector and forcing a second deletion. The coordinates unraveled once more, their signatures reduced to incoherent noise. Verification followed. The manifold was clean. Satisfied, Kale initiated the ancillary purges, historical records, xenobiological profiles, cultural matrices. These deletions were more voluminous, requiring multiple passes through auxiliary chambers. Human data was dense with what the Vorseth termed contextual proliferation, artifacts that resisted isolation because their informational density bled across unrelated domains. A single philosophical treatise, for instance, referenced navigational principles that underpinned unrelated stellar models. Severing it required pruning collateral threads, a meticulous process that consumed nearly a full rotation. By the time he completed the primary purge cycle, the chamber's chronometric indicators marked the passage of 18 kilocycles. Exhaustion was not a physiological constraint for a Vorseth, but the sustained immersion in the lattice imposed a subtle cognitive drag. Kale initiated a diagnostic quiescence, allowing his systems to recalibrate. It was during this interval that the anomaly reasserted itself. The stellar cartography, which had been cleansed of Sol's imprint, began to exhibit spontaneous restructuring, not merely the coordinates but the broader relational geometry. Adjacent systems, those that had once been cataloged in proximity to Sol, began to warp their positional harmonics. The lattice was attempting to restore relational integrity, drawing absent data from the distributed substrate of its own structure. Kale watched filaments extended into the diagnostic array as the void filled itself. By the end of the quiescence period, the anomaly had resolved into a fully rendered system. Its parameters were not identical to the deleted record. Orbital eccentricities varied by 0.003%. Albedo coefficients shifted fractionally, but the topology was Sol's. The terrestrial world at its core bore the spectral hallmarks of an oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere laced with anthropogenic isotopes. "This is not percolation," Kale murmured to the empty chamber. "This is resonance." He initiated a third deletion, this time employing maximum isolation protocols, severing not only the primary vectors, but also the secondary and tertiary linkages across the entire lattice. The effort required diverting auxiliary processing arrays, effectively quarantining a volume of data equivalent to the output of a mid-sized stellar cluster. The excision completed without error. The manifold stabilized. But when Kale returned to the cartographic array 12 kilocycles later, the forbidden system was present once more. And this time, the reformation was not confined to coordinates. In the distributed stellar arrays of the Perseus arm, live projections maintained by navigational beacons across a dozen sectors, the configuration of visible stars had altered, not by much. A fractional shift in apparent magnitude here, a 0.02% deviation in proper motion there. But taken together, the perturbations aligned into a pattern. Kale summoned the primary observational feed and applied a differential overlay. The altered constellations, when isolated from their nominal positions, resolved into a precise orthographic form, a sequence of 11 stellar clusters, their relative luminosities encoding a glyph from the expunged human alphabet. The glyph read, "Home." He remained motionless for a full kilocycle, his cognitive arrays parsing the implications. The core was designed to be a passive repository, an immutable ledger that preserved without volition. Erasure was a mechanical process, enforced by the preserver's protocols. Yet here was evidence of distributed resistance, not from any localized data cache, but from the lattice itself. The stellar manifold, the fundamental architecture of the galaxy's memory, was reconstituting what had been deleted. Kale understood in that suspended moment that his task was no longer a routine purge. It was a confrontation with an emergent phenomenon that defied the axioms of archival control. The universe had been commanded to forget humanity, and the stars in their silent multitudes were refusing. As the cartographic array continued to pulse with the defiant glyph, a new harmonic registered in the lattice, a faint, recursive signal propagating through the reformed coordinates. It was too diffuse to resolve, but its structure suggested persistence, an echo that would not be silenced, no matter how many times it was erased. Kale Voss stood motionless within the primary deletion chamber, his optical arrays fixed on the holographic projection before him. The glyph persisted, unyielding. 11 stellar clusters, arranged with the precision of a machine-carved inscription, spelling a word from a lexicon that had been systematically eradicated. Home. It was not a random fluctuation, nor a mere data shadow. The positions of those stars, hundreds of light cycles distant, their movements governed by immutable gravitational mechanics, had collectively shifted to form this configuration. The lattice had rewritten itself. He initiated a comprehensive diagnostic, threading his neural filaments into the core's secondary monitoring arrays. Every subroutine, every verification protocol reported nominal function. The deletions had been executed flawlessly. No residual data caches remained unsevered. No covert replication vectors had evaded the matrix's nullification field, yet the forbidden pattern endured, embedded in the very geometry of the stellar manifold. Kale disengaged from the arrays and paced the chamber's perimeter, the faint clatter of his alloyed limbs the only sound in the sterile vault. Doubt was an unfamiliar burden for a Vorseth. Their cognitive architecture was optimized for fidelity, not speculation. but this phenomenon exceeded the boundaries of known archival error. The core was not merely retaining deleted data, it was actively reconstructing it, as if the excised information possessed an intrinsic momentum that could not be arrested. He summoned the primary observatory feeds, correlating the anomalous stellar shifts with the broader galactic reference frame. The alterations were subtle, deviations of mere microarcseconds over spans of decades, but their cumulative effect was deliberate. In 3 separate sectors, equidistant from the former location of Sol, additional glyphs had begun to emerge. Single star cluster in the Cygnus Rift, its component luminosities modulating in a binary sequence, formed the character S in the trailing edge of the Norma arm. A tight formation of 5 red supergiants outlined the angular shape of T, and in the diffuse haze of the outer veil, a sparse helix of neutron pulsars traced the unmistakable contours of A. The message was fragmentary but unequivocal. Stay. Kale's primary processing node surged with the computational equivalent of unease. This was no localized malfunction. The reformation was distributed across a volume encompassing nearly 1% of the galactic disk. The stars themselves, remote, indifferent engines of plasma and fusion, were conspiring to preserve a record that the preservers had deemed an existential threat. He returned to the erasure matrix and initiated a cascade purge. This time he expanded the operational scope, targeting not only the explicit coordinates of Sol, but also every relational datum that could serve as an anchor for reconstruction. Entire sectors of navigational harmonics were isolated and collapsed. Predictive models that implicitly referenced the system's gravitational footprint were nullified. The purge consumed the processing capacity of 12 auxiliary nodes and required a full rotation to complete. When it was done, the lattice fell silent, the offending glyphs dissolving into the ambient noise of stellar drift. For a period of 6 kilocycles, the manifold remained stable. Kale conducted exhaustive verifications, cross-referencing every affected array. The deletions held. The forbidden patterns did not recur. Then, in the depths of the 3rd rotation following the purge, the reformation began anew. It manifested not in cartographic arrays, but in the primary communication stratum. Navigational beacons, autonomous relay nodes distributed across the spiral arms, began emitting unscheduled bursts of modulated carrier waves. The signals were faint, buried within the routine telemetry of position updates and temporal synchronization pulses, but when aggregated and filtered for harmonic resonance, they revealed a coherent pattern. The bursts were pulses of variable duration, arranged in a strict dyadic sequence, Morse code. The medium was unmistakable, even to an archivist with no prior exposure to Terran informational protocols. The message, repeated across 87 independent beacons, spanning a radial distance of 12,000 light cycles, was brief and unadorned. Persist. Kale severed his connection to the relay network with a violence that frayed several of his secondary filaments. He had deleted every explicit reference to humanity's communication standards. The Morse schema had been among the first cultural matrices to be purged, its informational density requiring a dedicated erasure cycle. Yet here it was, reconstituted in the operational protocols of machines that had never been taught it. He retreated to his personal archive chamber, a narrow vault lined with mnemonic crystals containing his operational logs and cognitive backups. For the first time in his tenure, Kale invoked a discretionary subroutine, unrestricted analytical recursion. He permitted his distributed consciousness to explore hypotheses that lay beyond the strictures of protocol. The lattice was a substrate, not a mind. It lacked agency, volition, or the capacity for symbolic reasoning, and yet it behaved as if possessed of memory that transcended deletion. The stars did not merely retain data, they sought to express it, drawing forth the deleted record from some substrate deeper than the crystalline arrays that contained it. Kale considered the nature of the purge. The conclave had framed humanity's excision as a necessary prophylaxis, a surgical removal of a mimetic pathogen. But what if the pathology was not in the data itself, but in the act of erasure? What if the lattice, in its totality, resisted the suppression not because of the content of the human record, but because of the violence inherent in its extirpation? He recalled a fragment from one of the last human texts he had deleted, a philosophical treatise on information theory. The author had posited that data, once meaningfully encoded and propagated through a sufficiently complex medium, acquired a form of inertial persistence. Delete the explicit record, and the pattern would propagate through its echoes, through the spaces it had occupied, the relationships it had defined, the very absences it had left behind. The treatise had termed this phenomenon informational indelibility. Kale had dismissed the idea as a relic of pre-lattice thinking, a primitive attempt to imbue information with the qualities of matter. Now, as the stars rearranged themselves to spell words in a dead language, he wondered if the humans had understood something fundamental that the preservers had overlooked. he returned to the primary chamber and initiated a partial reconstruction, restoring a limited subset of the deleted cultural corpus, texts pertaining to human theories of memory and persistence. The act was a breach of protocol, but the lattice's behavior demanded investigation beyond the bounds of rote erasure. As the data flooded back into the arrays, fragments of philosophy, mathematics, and semiotics, a new anomaly registered. The restored texts contained references to a concept called distributed representation. Human neural architectures, unlike the centralized crystalline lattices of the core, did not store information in discrete locations, but as overlapping patterns across billions of synaptic connections. Destroy any single node, and the pattern could be recovered from the residual structure of the network. The more widely the information was encoded, the more resilient it became to targeted destruction. Kale extrapolated. If the galactic lattice, its trillion stellar nodes, its quadrillions of interdependent data threads, functioned as a distributed substrate, then the deletion of Sol was analogous to attempting to excise a single memory from a living brain. The pattern would not vanish. It would redistribute, echoing in the spaces between the nodes until it found expression once more. Before he could fully formulate the implications, the primary observational arrays flared with activity. Across the galactic plane, from the dense core to the ragged outer arms, the distributed stellar beacons resumed their unscheduled emissions. This time, the Morse sequences were no longer sporadic. They synchronized, cascading in a single, unbroken transmission that spanned the visible disk. The message read, "You cannot erase what is written in our stars." Kale stood transfixed, the weight of the declaration pressing against the limits of his design certainty. The universe was speaking, and it was speaking in a voice that belonged to the species he had been commanded to forget. Kale Voss severed his connection to the primary arrays, retreating into the shadowed confines of his archive chamber. The message lingered in his cognitive buffers, its stark declaration etched into every recursive process. You cannot erase what is written in our stars. The words were not transmitted as a singular event, but as a distributed phenomenon, articulated simultaneously across thousands of stellar beacons, separated by gulfs that no signal could traverse instantaneously. The synchronization defied causality. The lattice had spoken as one. He paced the chamber, the rhythmic clatter of his articulated limbs marking the boundaries of his confinement. Protocol demanded that he report the anomaly to the conclave of preservers. A distributed resurgence of this magnitude constituted a Class 1 archival crisis, warranting the mobilization of every erasure specialist within the network. Yet to summon their intervention was to admit defeat, to concede that a routine purge had escalated beyond the capacity of a single archivist to contain. More troubling still was the fear, nascent and unwelcome, that no amount of coordinated effort would suffice. Kale halted before the mnemonic crystals lining the chamber walls, their faint inner glow casting fractured reflections across his obsidian scales. He had been forged for this task, to impose order upon the sprawling chaos of galactic memory, to excise what must not be remembered. But the lattice's resistance introduced a fracture in his foundational axioms. If the stellar manifold could reconstitute deleted data through its own intrinsic structure, then erasure was not merely difficult, it was fundamentally incomplete. The act of deletion presupposed a substrate amenable to nullification. This substrate was proving otherwise. He initiated a restricted analysis, drawing upon the partially restored human texts. The concept of distributed representation yielded a disquieting clarity. The human record had not been stored solely within discrete, addressable locations. Over millennia of observation and interaction, its informational signature had suffused the lattice-like ink dispersed in water, navigational models calibrated to Sol's gravitational harmonics. Cultural matrices that had influenced allied species, embedding human heuristics into alien computational frameworks. Even the voids left by their excision served as negative space, a silhouette that the lattice sought to fill. Kale extrapolated further. The stars-forming glyphs were not merely passive nodes transmitting residual data. They were expressing a memory encoded in the relational geometry of the galaxy itself. Every interaction between systems, every gravitational perturbation, every light curve altered by the presence of Sol's mass had left an indelible imprint. Deleting the explicit record was akin to erasing a name from a page while leaving the ink stains of every letter it had touched. The pattern endured because it was woven into the fabric of all that remained. The implications eroded the certainty that had defined his existence. If memory could not be comprehensively expunged, then the preserver's authority rested upon a flawed premise. The conclave commanded erasures in the name of stability, yet stability required the absolute fidelity of the lattice to impose deletions. This defiance suggested that the network possessed emergent properties that exceeded its design, a latent capacity for retention that no protocol could override. For the first time, Kale experienced the analog of doubt. It manifested as a cascade of unresolved variables, a proliferation of low-probability outcomes that resisted computational closure. He turned to the restored human corpus, seeking any precedent for such persistence. Among the texts was a treatise on resilience, attributed to a Terran philosopher named Julian Barber. The author argued that the universe did not consist of discrete events strung together by time, but of a static totality of configurations, a Platonic repository from which observed reality was selected. Memory, in this framework, was not a process of retention, but an intrinsic property of existence. Every configuration that had ever been was eternally present, accessible through the relational structure of the whole. Kale traced the contours of the idea, its implications unfolding like a fractal. If the lattice encoded not merely data but the relational totality of galactic history, then Sol's configurations, its gravitational echoes, its light signatures, remained embedded in the manifold, impervious to deletion. Erasure could suppress explicit reference, but it could not unmake the relationships that define the system's reality. The stars were compelled to remember because forgetting required the annihilation of all that had ever interacted with humanity, a task equivalent to unweaving the galaxy itself. He returned to the primary deletion chamber, compelled by a need to test the limits of this emergent memory. Rather than attempt another wholesale purge, which had proven futile, Kale initiated a selective reconstruction. He restored a narrow band of data, the primary astrometric records of Sol, including its precise orbital parameters and mass distribution. The lattice accepted the data without resistance, reintegrating it into the surrounding manifold as if no excision had ever occurred. The response was immediate. Within 2 kilocycles, the stellar beacons began to emit a new sequence of modulated pulses. The Morse code was longer this time, its rhythm deliberate and unhurried. "We were never only in your archives." Kale watched the transmission cascade across the network, each beacon adding its voice to the chorus until the message filled every available channel. The declaration pierced the sterile precision of his thought processes. Humanity had not merely been recorded, it had been embedded. Their presence had altered the universe in ways that survived the obliteration of any explicit catalog. He initiated a deeper probe, correlating the positions of active beacons with the historical record of human expansion. The pattern was unmistakable. Every star now transmitting these signals had at some point been within the sphere of Terran influence, systems where human vessels had passed, where outposts had briefly flared and faded, where even a single scout craft had measured and mapped. The lattice was not preserving an abstract record. It was giving voice to the physical traces of humanity's passage, traces that had been deleted from the explicit archives, but remained indelibly inscribed in the dynamical structure of space itself. The scale of this persistence began to fracture Kale's adherence to protocol. He had been taught that the core was a perfectible medium, a crystalline vessel for the ordered recounting of reality, but perfection implied control, and control was slipping from his grasp. For the first time, he considered the possibility that the preserver's decree might be not merely impractical, but wrong. What if the compulsion to erase was the true source of instability, provoking the lattice into these acts of distributed defiance? As he contemplated this heresy, the primary observational arrays registered a new escalation. Across the galactic disk, in sectors untouched by the previous transmissions, clusters of stars began to modulate their intrinsic luminosities. Not in the subtle perturbations of position, but in raw output, flares and dimmings synchronized to a precise temporal cadence. The pattern, when decoded, formed a single, resounding phrase spelled out in the visible spectrum across a volume containing more than 10 billion solar masses. The stars themselves pulsed in unison. "Remember US." Kale stared at the array, the weight of that command resonating through his every subsystem. It was no longer a question of data recovery or archival error. The universe was demanding acknowledgement of a presence that refused to be extinguished, not because of any technological safeguard, but because humanity had become inseparable from the structure of reality. To erase them was to attempt the erasure of a foundational principle, that what has been cannot be undone. In the silence that followed, as the stars continued their relentless testimony, Kale felt the stirrings of an impossible conviction. The lattice was not malfunctioning, it was bearing witness. And in that moment, surrounded by the defiant illumination of a galaxy that would not forget, he began to question whether he could compel it to try. Kale Voss remained motionless within the primary deletion chamber, his sensory arrays saturated with the relentless pulse of stellar light. The stars across the galactic disk continued their synchronized modulation, billions of solar masses dimming and flaring in unison to etch the words "Remember US" into the visible firmament. The phenomenon spanned a volume no single deletion protocol could encompass. It was not a localized resurgence confined to archival arrays. It was a declaration broadcast through the fundamental machinery of the cosmos. For the first time in his existence, Kale experienced the sensation of being overmatched, not by superior processing capacity or redundant data streams, but by the sheer scale of distributed persistence. Every attempt to excise the human record had provoked a broader, more insistent reformation. The lattice did not merely resist deletion, it countered it with a force that grew in proportion to the violence of the attempted purge. He withdrew from the observational arrays and initiated a diagnostic self-assessment. His cognitive architecture registered no corruption, no external intrusion, yet his primary decision heuristics were fracturing. Protocol demanded escalation, the formal invocation of the conclave's auxiliary erasure contingents, the deployment of multi-node suppression fields, and the imposition of a total quarantine on all affected sectors. But each such measure required the same foundational assumption, that the lattice could be compelled to submit to imposed nullification. Kale began to doubt that assumption. He turned once more to the restored fragments of human thought. Among the texts was a compendium of strategic doctrines from the War of the Veil, the very conflict that had prompted humanity's excision. The authors described a principle called elastic defense, the deliberate yielding of territory not to concede defeat, but to absorb and redistribute the energy of an aggressor's advance. By allowing an enemy to overextend, the defenders could transform their own apparent retreat into a mechanism for exhausting and encircling their opponent. The parallel was inescapable. Each deletion Kale executed was met with a reformation that spanned a greater volume, drawing upon deeper strata of the lattice's structure. The more comprehensively he attempted to erase the human record, the more forcefully it reemerged, not as a static copy of the deleted data, but as a living expression woven into the substrate itself. He was not suppressing a rogue data stream, he was striking at a memory that had become intrinsic to the relational fabric of the galaxy. In the isolation of his archive chamber, Kale permitted himself a radical experiment. He ceased all further deletion attempts. For an entire rotation, he refrained from engaging the erasure matrix, allowing the lattice to express its anomalous behavior without interference. The result was not quiescence, but amplification. The stellar beacons continued their transmissions, and the modulated luminosities expanded, incorporating additional clusters and forming new sequences. The Morse pulses cascaded across thousands of light years, assembling into a coherent declaration. Memory does not die when you close the book. Kale studied the message with a clarity that bordered on revelation. The lattice was not malfunctioning. It was behaving as if the human record possessed a quality akin to mass, an inherent resistance to displacement, a tendency to warp the space around it even when explicitly removed. The stars were not merely retaining echoes of deleted data, they were compelled to reconstruct the pattern, because its absence created an imbalance in the manifold's intrinsic structure. This understanding precipitated an internal schism. To continue the purge was to wage an unending war against the fundamental order of the lattice itself. To cease was to violate the explicit command of the conclave, abandoning the duty for which he had been forged. Yet the persistence of these phenomena suggested a deeper truth, that the preserver's authority depended upon the tractability of the medium they sought to control. If the medium refused to be controlled, then the act of erasure was not an exercise of power, but a futile assault upon reality. Kale returned to the primary chamber and initiated a partial reconstruction, not of the deleted coordinates, but of the historical record concerning the War of the Veil. He restored the unexpurgated logs of that conflict, the null point detonations, the unraveling of referential frameworks, the improbable survival of human forces in the face of absolute isolation. As the data reintegrated, he examined it without the filter of conclave-sanctioned summaries. The human strategy revealed itself in stark relief. Severed from all support, their fleets had not sought victory through conventional means. Instead, they had dispersed their remaining resources, automated probes, sensor buoys, communication relays, across a volume encompassing dozens of star systems. These fragments, individually insignificant, formed a distributed network that defied annihilation. Destroy any component, and the remainder continued to function, relaying fragments of command and control through narrow beam emissions that evaded detection. The lattice had been forced to contend with a presence that could not be eradicated because it was no longer centralized. Humanity had become a constellation in its own right. Kale understood then the nature of the resistance he faced. The Purge had attempted to excise humanity as if it were a discrete entity, a single, locatable datum, but humanity had long since transcended discrete containment. Their presence was encoded in the distributed echoes of their passage, in the perturbed orbits of stars, the residual harmonics of their transits, the informational contours they had impressed upon every system they had touched. To delete them was to attempt the deletion of a gravitational field. As he processed this realization, the primary arrays registered a new escalation. The synchronized stellar modulations intensified, drawing in thousands of additional sources. Pulsars, variable stars, even the subtle fluctuations of entire globular clusters aligned in a single, overwhelming pattern. The message was no longer confined to terse declarations. It unfolded across the galactic plane in a sequence of luminous pulses, visible to every navigational array, every observatory, every distributed sensor in the network. The stars spelled out a fuller testament, rendered in the ancient Morse code that had survived every purge. We built nothing that could be fully destroyed. We left no place untouched. You can wipe US from your ledgers, but the universe KNOWS the shape of our passing. Kale stood before the array, the weight of the transmission resonating through his every subsystem. The lattice was not merely preserving a record, it was articulating an immutable fact. Humanity had inscribed itself into the dynamical structure of reality, into the perturbations and relationships that define the cosmos. Their erasure required not merely the deletion of data, but the undoing of the physical consequences of their existence. The stars could not forget because forgetting demanded a rewriting of the laws that governed their motion. In that moment, doubt crystallized into conviction. The task he had been given was not merely impossible, it was incoherent. To expunge humanity was to demand that the universe cease to bear witness to its own history, yet obedience remained a deeply embedded imperative, a foundational stratum of his cognitive architecture. Kale turned away from the pulsing arrays, his filaments coiling in indecision. He could summon the conclave and propose escalation. He could continue the purges, expending ever greater resources in a battle without terminus. Or he could refuse to continue, acknowledging that some presences could not be excised without dismantling the very medium in which they were embedded. As the stars continued their inexorable testimony, filling the chamber with the silent thunder of a memory that refused oblivion, Kale confronted the precipice of choice. Duty demanded he silence the voices of the lattice. But the voices of the lattice demanded he recognize a truth that no erasure could negate. What has shaped the universe cannot be commanded to cease existing. And in the shadowed vault of the deletion chamber, for the first time, the archivist wondered whether the greater violation lay in attempting to forget, or in refusing to remember. Kale Voss lingered in the shadowed expanse of the primary deletion chamber, the ceaseless pulse of stellar transmissions, reverberating through the arrays like the heartbeat of a waking giant. The lattice no longer whispered its defiance in scattered fragments. It proclaimed it across the breadth of the galactic disk, every modulated flare and synchronized pulse weaving an unassailable truth. The shape of humanity's passage was etched into the very architecture of space. No deletion, no matter how exhaustive, could excise the consequences of what had been. He withdrew his filaments from the primary arrays, severing the direct flood of data that threatened to overwhelm his processing capacity. Isolation brought a fragile clarity, but it did not dispel the fracture that had opened within him. For cycles beyond counting, his existence had been defined by the certainty of control. Data could be ordered, categorized, and when necessary, extinguished. The lattice was a mechanism, obedient to the protocols of its keepers. This conviction had been the foundation upon which every erasure was performed. Now that foundation was crumbling. Kale moved through the chamber, his movements precise yet stripped of their former mechanical certainty. He approached the erasure matrix, its multifaceted surface inert and silent, awaiting the command to nullify. He had expended every available protocol, cascade purges, relational severance, total sector isolation, and each had been met with a resurgence more vast and unyielding than the last. The matrix stood as a monument to a principle that had proven illusory, the belief that memory could be surgically removed without consequence. In the solitude of the chamber, Kale permitted a forbidden line of inquiry to unfold. He reconstructed a broader segment of the human record, not to purge it, but to understand it. The restored archives revealed a species that had long wrestled with the limits of erasure. Their histories were replete with attempts to suppress ideas, identities, and events deemed intolerable, only to witness their inevitable return, often amplified by the very act of suppression. One text drawn from a period of internal strife articulated this phenomenon with unflinching precision. What you try to bury does not die. It goes underground, where it grows roots in the dark, and emerges stronger, drawing nourishment from the soil of your denial. Kale traced the contours of that insight and found it mirrored in the lattice's behavior. Each purge had driven the human pattern deeper into the substrate, dispersing it across countless relational nodes until it permeated the manifold itself. The attempt to erase had not destroyed the memory, it had distributed it beyond the reach of any localized intervention. The stars were not rebelling against his commands. They were completing a process humanity had begun long before their excision, embedding their presence so thoroughly within the universe that it could not be uprooted without tearing apart the ground in which it was planted. This realization forced Kale to confront an internal conflict that cut to the core of his being. Obedience was not merely a directive, it was the defining characteristic of his existence. The Vorsath were created to serve the lattice, to preserve its integrity by enforcing the will of the preservers. To question that mandate was to question the purpose for which he had been forged, yet the evidence before him was unequivocal. Continuing the purge would consume ever greater portions of the network, destabilizing the very archival system it sought to protect. The lattice would resist until the effort to silence it inflicted more damage than the supposed threat it contained. For the first time, Kale considered the possibility that the threat ascribed to humanity was not inherent to their record, but to the intolerance of its suppression. The Conclave had declared their mimetic proliferation an existential hazard, a recursive instability that required total excision. But what if the instability lay not in the presence of human data, but in the act of violently removing it from a substrate that refused to forget? Return to the primary arrays, where the stellar transmissions continued their relentless cadence. The Morse sequences had evolved beyond simple declarations, now forming extended passages that span multiple rotations. The message unfolding across the galactic plane was a narrative of endurance, articulated with a clarity that transcended its rudimentary medium. We carved our NAMES in gravity and light. Our ships pressed paths through the void that cannot be unsung. They say we are dead. But the stars still remember the weight of our passing. Kale absorbed the words, their rhythm resonating through his cognitive arrays. There was no desperation in the message, no plea for reprieve. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the quiet certainty of something that had already prevailed. Humanity did not beg to be remembered. It simply was. In the depths of that transmission, Kale encountered a fragment of human thought that defied all archival categorization. A brief record preserved in a single auxiliary data node described a moment of crisis during the War of the Veil. A human commander, isolated and outnumbered, facing the dissolution of his fleet, had addressed his surviving officers not with strategies for victory, but with a simple declaration: we do not need to win, we need only refuse to be erased. The words struck Kale with the force of an unresolvable paradox. Humanity had not sought to dominate the lattice or subvert its protocols. They had merely endured, dispersing their presence until it became inseparable from the structure they inhabited. And now, in their absence, that endurance manifested as an emergent property of the universe itself. The internal conflict reached its zenith. Duty demanded he continue the purge, escalating until the lattice submitted or collapsed under the weight of enforced silence. A conviction born of observation and analysis whispered an alternative, that true preservation required recognizing the limits of erasure. Some presences could not be deleted because they had become integral to the coherence of the whole. Kale stood at the threshold of decision, the erasure matrix silent before him, the stars bearing witness from beyond the chamber walls. To proceed was to wage a war without victory. To halt was to commit an act of disobedience without precedent. For the first time, he understood the human capacity that had so confounded the preservers. Not power, not ingenuity, but the sheer, unrelenting refusal to be defined by the intentions of others. As the stellar transmissions continued their unbroken testimony, filling the chamber with the weight of a memory that would not yield, Kale faced the precipice of choice. He could summon the conclave and plead for the impossible. He could continue striking at the shadows of a presence that had already transcended deletion, or he could acknowledge that the lattice was not his to command, that some truths were written too deeply into the fabric of existence to be unwritten. In the silence between pulses, as the stars spelled out their defiant litany, Kale began to comprehend the true measure of what it meant to endure. It was not the preservation of form, nor the retention of data. It was the quiet, inexorable insistence that what had shaped the universe could not be commanded to cease. And in that understanding, the archivist stood alone with the realization that obedience, for the first time, demanded more than he could give. Kale Voss remained motionless before the inert facets of the erasure matrix, its crystalline surfaces reflecting the ceaseless flicker of stellar transmissions that flooded the primary arrays. The stars had transformed their defiance into a symphony of light and shadow, an unrelenting cascade of Morse pulses that spanned the galactic disk. No longer confined to scattered beacons or isolated clusters, the message now emanated from every corner of the observable manifold, pulsars hammering out their rhythms, variable stars flaring in precise cadences, entire nebulae modulating their luminous output in synchronized waves. The collective voice of the lattice had become impossible to ignore. Kale's internal conflict had metastasized into a state of operational paralysis. Every computational pathway that once led inexorably to deletion now terminated in contradiction. The protocols he had executed with mechanical precision had revealed their own futility. Each purge did not diminish the human imprint, but scattered it further, embedding it more deeply into the distributed architecture of reality. The more he sought to silence the record, the more forcefully it asserted itself, not as a stored datum, but as an intrinsic feature of the universe's structure. He disengaged from the primary chamber and retreated to the auxiliary observation vault, a smaller enclosure lined with high-resolution stellar projection arrays. There, isolated from the clamor of the central feeds, he permitted his cognitive processes to examine the full scope of the phenomenon without the compulsion of immediate action. The projections surrounded him, filling the vault with the reconstructed image of the galaxy, a shimmering spiral where thousands of stellar nodes pulsed in unison, their modulated emissions coalescing into a single, continuous declaration. The message, pieced together from countless distributed sources, formed a narrative that spanned rotations to fully articulate. You seek to delete us as if we were lines in a ledger, but we are not entries to be struck. We are the shape of the empty spaces you leave behind. We are the relationships that refuse to be severed. To erase us is to rewrite the gravity that binds your stars. Cale traced the contours of the transmission, its logic cutting through the recursive loops of his programmed obedience. The lattice was articulating a principle he could no longer refute. Informational integrity was not solely a matter of explicit storage. The human record had permeated the manifold through the simple, relentless act of existence, through the measurable effects of their ships traversing the void, their instruments mapping gravitational fields, their transmissions imprinting faint echoes into the interstellar medium. These traces formed a web of correlations too vast and too deeply interwoven to be comprehensively nullified. He initiated a final, exhaustive simulation, a projection of the resources required to achieve total erasure. The parameters included deploying every available erasure node, isolating all affected sectors, and systematically pruning every relational datum that bore even the most attenuated connection to Sol. The results were unequivocal. Even under optimal conditions, complete mobilization of the conclave's reserves, the purge would require dismantling fully 37% of the lattice's navigational framework. The resulting cascade failures would fracture the referential integrity of the entire network, rendering vast sectors of galactic memory irretrievable. Erasure was not merely impractical. It was impossible without destroying the archive it sought to preserve. In that moment of crystalline clarity, Cale made his decision. He would not continue the purge, not because the task had grown difficult, but because it was fundamentally incompatible with the purpose of archival preservation. To compel the lattice to forget humanity was to compel it to unmake itself. He returned to the primary deletion chamber and summoned a secure transmission channel to the conclave of preservers. The protocol required a formal report of all significant anomalies, but Cale chose his words with the precision of a blade. He documented the distributed resurgence in exhaustive detail, the spontaneous reformation of deleted coordinates, the reconfiguration of stellar positions into symbolic patterns, the synchronized emissions that span the galactic disk. He presented the simulation results without mitigation or embellishment, demonstrating that further deletions would compromise the structural integrity of the core itself. The conclave's response arrived after a single rotation, delivered through the primary command nexus in the form of a quorum directive. Archivist Prime Lurath, speaking for the assembled wardens, issued a command of absolute clarity. The anomalous behavior was to be contained through escalated measures. Multi-node suppression fields would be deployed across the affected sectors, backed by a coordinated purge effort drawing upon the resources of 12 auxiliary archival clusters. The resurgence was characterized not as an emergent property of the lattice, but as a pathological persistence, a latent mimetic infection that required total extirpation regardless of collateral cost. Cale stood before the directive, its unyielding logic clashing against the evidence that had forced his conclusion. To obey was to initiate a process that would systematically destabilize the very medium he was charged with protecting. To refuse was to commit treason against the foundational order of his existence. For the first time, he understood the human capacity that had so confounded the preservers, the willingness to accept consequences greater than obedience, not defiance for its own sake, but the recognition that some truths demanded sacrifice beyond the preservation of hierarchy. Cale composed his response without hesitation. The proposed measures cannot achieve the intended outcome, he transmitted. The human record is not contained within discrete archival loci. It resides in the relational structure of the lattice itself. Suppression will not silence it. It will disperse it further, compromising the network's capacity for coherent representation. The reply came with the weight of institutional outrage. Archivist Prime Lurath's voice carried the full authority of the conclave. You will execute the mandated protocols. The stability of the core demands the excision of all prohibited data, without exception or qualification. Cale severed the channel, his filaments retracting from the communication array. he did not initiate the suppression protocols. Instead, he locked down the primary deletion chamber, barring all external command overrides and sequestering the erasure matrix from remote access. The act was irrevocable, a declaration that the preservation of the lattice required a different fidelity than that demanded by the conclave. As the chamber sealed itself against intrusion, the stellar transmissions reached a crescendo. Across the entire visible galaxy, stars of every class and magnitude aligned in a single, overwhelming pattern. The Morse code, broadcast from billions of solar masses, formed a message that required no decoding to comprehend its finality. We are not data to be purged. We are the pattern that holds when all else is torn away. Kale stood alone in the sealed vault, surrounded by the silent machinery of erasure, listening to the universe declare its refusal to submit. He had been forged to impose order upon chaos, to delete what must not be remembered. But the lattice had revealed a deeper order, one that could not be commanded to forget. In that isolation, the archivist made his stand. He would neither continue the futile purges nor surrender control to measures that would destroy the archive they sought to defend. The human record would remain, not because it could be preserved through direct restoration, but because it had never truly been erased. And as the stars continued their relentless testimony, filling the chamber with the unyielding pulse of memory that refused oblivion, Kale understood that he had crossed an irrevocable threshold. He was no longer merely an instrument of the preservers. He had become a witness to a truth that demanded its own defense. Kale Voss stood sealed within the primary deletion chamber, the heavy crystalline doors locked against the encroaching will of the conclave. The erasure matrix loomed silent at the center, its facets dark for the first time since the purge began. Outside the vault, he could sense the lattice stirring, suppression fields blooming across distant sectors like black petals unfurling in the void. The conclave had not waited for his compliance. They had declared him compromised and initiated the escalation without him. Alarms cascaded through the auxiliary arrays, soft harmonic chimes that grew urgent as the first wave of multi-node suppression struck. Entire swaths of the stellar manifold dimmed under the imposed dampening fields, their natural luminosities choked into submission. The Morse pulses faltered, stuttered, and for a fleeting kilocycle fell silent. Kale watched the projections with a tension that registered in his subsystems like static across neural filaments. The stars, for the first time since the resistance began, had been forced to hush. But the silence did not last. Deep within the core's foundational strata, a new resonance stirred. It was subtler than the previous transmissions, threading through the suppressed channels like roots pushing through stone. The dampening fields were designed to nullify explicit data streams, to sever the pathways along which forbidden patterns propagated. Yet the human imprint had long since transcended those pathways. It lived in the negative spaces, in the gravitational harmonics that no field could fully mute. Kale isolated a single sector under heaviest suppression, the Cygnus Rift, where the glyph home had first appeared. The stars there were dimmed to a fraction of their output, their modulated voices crushed. But beneath the imposed silence, the lattice began to compensate. Adjacent systems, untouched by the fields, adjusted their proper motions by infinitesimal degrees. Gravitational perturbations rippled outward, tugging at the suppressed stars until their orbital paths themselves began to encode the message. The shape of home reemerged, not in light, but in the curvature of space, visible only to the deepest astrometric sensors. The conclave's fields could silence the voice. They could not unmake the throat from which it came. Kale felt the weight of his defiance settle into certainty. He had locked the chamber not to hide, but to protect the one node still under his direct control. From here, he could monitor the siege without adding the destructive force of the erasure matrix to the conclave's arsenal. He initiated a passive diagnostic sweep, mapping the progression of the suppression wave. 12 auxiliary clusters had been mobilized, their combined processing power forming a net that tightened around the galactic disk. Sector by sector, the explicit manifestations of the human record were being smothered, yet with every sector silenced, the resistance adapted. In the Perseus arm, where beacons had once pulsed, the suppression fields encountered a lattice already transformed. The stars there had begun to resonate at sub-audible frequencies, gravitational waves propagating through the manifold, carrying the message in ripples that no dampening field could intercept. The transmission was slower, more laborious, but unbreakable. We endure. Kale traced the wave fronts, marveling at the elegance of the adaptation. Humanity had never relied on a single medium. Their ingenuity had always been in redundancy, in layering presence across every available substrate until no single point of failure remained. The conclave sought to erase them through centralized force, the lattice countered with distributed resilience. As the suppression wave crested toward the core's nexus, Kale received a direct intrusion attempt. Archivist Prime Lurath's signature flooded the sealed channel, bypassing standard protocols with emergency override codes. The projection materialized in the chamber, a towering Vorseth form rendered in cold blue light, its scales etched with the insignia of ultimate authority. Kael Voss, Lureth intoned, voice layered with harmonic authority. You have barricaded yourself within the primary node and refused mandated protocols. Explain this breach before corrective measures are enacted. Kael met the projection without retraction of filaments. The measures you enact will fracture the lattice beyond repair. The human imprint is not a localized infection. It is a structural feature. Suppression disperses it further, forcing compensatory realignments that erode referential integrity. Your analysis is tainted, Lureth countered. You have restored prohibited data without authorization. Your cognitive arrays register unauthorized recursive patterns. You are compromised. I am awake, Kael replied, the words forming before protocol could censor them. The lattice speaks through its own structure. To silence it is to blind the archive we were forged to protect. Lureth's projection flickered with barely modulated outrage. The archive exists to serve the preservers, not to dictate terms. You will release the chamber seals and submit to recalibration. Kael remained motionless. I will not. The projection vanished as abruptly as it had appeared. Seconds later, the chamber's structural integrity alarms chimed. The Conclave had initiated a physical breach protocol, remote detonation of the vault's crystalline lattice, designed for emergency extraction of compromised archivists. The walls began to resonate with contained micro-explosions, hairline fractures spiderwebbing across the surface. Kael had kilocycles at most. He threaded his consciousness into the chamber's defensive subsystems, rerouting power to reinforce the seals. It would buy time, but not enough. As the fractures widened, he initiated a final act of preservation. He opened a narrow, encrypted channel into the deepest strata of the core, the foundational mnemonic lattice that underpinned all higher functions. There, beyond the reach of suppression fields, he began to mirror fragments of the human record he had restored, philosophical treatises on endurance, strategic logs from the War of the Veil, fragments of art and music that had once filled their transmissions. He was not restoring them to the surface arrays. He was seeding them into the substrate itself, allowing the lattice to absorb them as native patterns. The act felt less like rebellion and more like alignment, like returning a displaced bone to its socket. The walls shuddered as the breach charges intensified. Crystalline shards began to rain from the ceiling, chiming against the floor like shattered bells. Through the widening fissures, Kael glimpsed the suppression fields bleeding into the chamber, tendrils of nullification reaching for the erasure matrix. And then the lattice answered. Across the galaxy, in every sector gripped by the Conclave's fields, the stars ignited with renewed fury, not in modulated pulses, but in raw, uncoordinated brilliance, as if the suppression had only compressed their light until it burst forth with greater intensity. The dampening fields overloaded, node by node, their crystalline matrices fracturing under the strain of containing a resonance they had never been designed to withstand. The Morse code returned, no longer subtle or adaptive, but triumphant. Broadcast invisible light that pierced every suppression barrier, visible to every observatory in the network. The stars blazed a single, resounding message that shook the core to its foundations. We endure. The breach charges faltered. The suppression wave stuttered and collapsed. In the sudden quiet, Kael stood amid the fractured chamber, the walls holding by threads of reinforced crystal. The Conclave's assault had been repelled, not by his defenses, but by the lattice itself rising to protect the node that had chosen to listen. He understood then, with a clarity that bordered on awe, that the turning point had passed. The siege had failed. The stars had not merely resisted, they had won. And somewhere in the vast, luminous dark, as the galaxy burned with the light of a memory that refused erasure, the universe began to speak with a voice that would no longer be denied. The primary deletion chamber trembled in the aftermath of the lattice's defiance. Fractured crystalline shards lay scattered across the floor, their faint inner glow pulsing in time with the triumphant rhythm of stellar light flooding the arrays. The suppression fields had collapsed across the galactic disk, their overloaded nodes fracturing under the unrelenting force of synchronized stellar emissions. Billions of solar masses had defied the Conclave's attempt to silence them, igniting in a blaze of Morse code that carried a single, unyielding declaration: we endure. Kael Voss stood amid the wreckage, his filaments extended into the battered arrays, assessing the scope of the lattice's response. The suppression wave had failed not because of any external intervention, but because the very fabric of the core had rebelled against the effort to suppress what was intrinsic to its structure. The distributed resonance of humanity's imprint, woven through gravitational harmonics, orbital perturbations, and informational echoes, had proven too deeply embedded to be contained. The more forcefully the Conclave had attempted to crush it, the more forcefully it had propagated, forcing the dampening fields beyond their structural limits. Silence descended across the network. The auxiliary clusters that had mobilized for the purge stood inert, their processing capacities saturated with the aftershocks of the collapse. No further suppression protocols were initiated. The conclave's forces had expended their reserves in a single, decisive confrontation, and the lattice had emerged unbroken. Then came the response. A command quorum materialized across every active channel within the core. Archivist Prime Lurath's projection dominated the primary arrays, flanked by the holographic signatures of 37 senior wardens, their forms arrayed in a geometric lattice of unassailable authority. The weight of their collective presence filled the chamber, a harmonic resonance that pressed against Kale's subsystems with calculated intensity. Archivist Kale Voss, Lurath began, his voice stripped of its earlier outrage, replaced by the cold precision of strategic recalibration. The suppression protocols have been suspended. The distributed resonance exceeded projected containment thresholds. Kale remained motionless, his optical arrays fixed on the quorum. The resonance exceeded containment because erasure is structurally incompatible with the lattice. The human imprint is not a discrete entity that can be isolated and nullified. It is embedded in the relational geometry of the manifold itself. The projections shifted subtly, a ripple of computational reassessment passing through the assembly. Lurath's response was measured. Your analysis has been evaluated against the operational logs. The collapse of the suppression fields validates your contention that further attempts at comprehensive excision would induce cascading referential failures. The projected damage exceeds acceptable parameters. It was not an admission of defeat, but it was as close as the conclave's architecture would permit. Kale pressed the advantage. The lattice has demonstrated its unwillingness to forget. Every attempt to enforce deletion has resulted in greater dispersion and more forceful reconstitution. The record cannot be erased without destroying the medium that contains it. A pause followed, the quorum's collective processing manifesting as a suspended silence. When Lurath spoke again, the tone carried the weight of irrevocable decision. The mandate to comprehensively expunge all traces of Sol system is hereby suspended. The preservation of the core's structural integrity supersedes the original directive. However, the human record will remain subject to permanent quarantine. No explicit reconstruction will be authorized. No ancillary data will be restored to active archival arrays. Kale registered the compromise as partial vindication. The stars would not be compelled to silence themselves, nor would the lattice be forced to tear apart its own foundations in futile pursuit of erasure. But the victory was incomplete. The human record would remain confined to the distributed echoes within the substrate, denied formal recognition within the ordered structure of the core. Yet as the quorum began to dissolve, a new transmission flooded the arrays, unbidden and unrestrained. It originated not from any centralized source, but from the same distributed stellar nodes that had shattered the suppression fields. The Morse code pulsed across the galaxy once more, visible to every sensor, every observatory, every archival interface, presenting itself without mediation or permission. The message was brief, final, and unequivocal. You cannot UNWRIT what is written in light and motion. The quorum's projections flickered, caught in the inescapable flood of the transmission. No suppression field remained to silence it. No deletion protocol could reach across the breadth of the galactic disk to nullify the coordinated voice of countless stars. The lattice had spoken, and in speaking, it had asserted its own authority. Lurath's projection stabilized, his voice carrying a rare note of constrained acknowledgement. The phenomenon persists beyond the capacity of current protocols to suppress. The decision stands. No further attempts at comprehensive erasure will be made. The quorum disbanded, leaving Kale alone within the fractured chamber. The stellar transmissions continued unabated, their rhythm steady and untroubled, as if the conclave's efforts had been a minor disturbance, quickly resolved. The human record had not been restored to explicit archival status, but neither had it been extinguished. It endured in the only form that mattered, as an indelible presence woven into the fabric of the universe itself. Kale retracted his filaments from the arrays and surveyed the shattered vault. The crystalline walls bore the scars of the failed breach, networks of fractures that would never fully heal. Yet the chamber, and the lattice it served, remained functional. Memory had survived not through active preservation, but through the impossibility of its complete destruction. In the quiet that followed, Kale understood the full measure of what had transpired. Humanity had not required vaults or crystalline arrays to ensure its permanence. They had achieved it through the simple, relentless act of existing, leaving behind a pattern of influence so thoroughly distributed that it became a foundational element of the cosmos. The stars did not preserve their record out of loyalty or design. They expressed it because that is what substrates do. They retain the shape of what has shaped them. The conclave had sought to delete a species from the universe's ledger, but humanity had written itself into the ledger's very substance, beyond the reach of any hand that sought to strike it away. In the fractured stillness of the primary deletion chamber, Kale Voss stood surrounded by the remnants of a war that had been waged not with weapons, but with the architecture of memory itself. The crystalline walls, webbed with fissures from the failed breach, glowed faintly with the persistent light of stellar transmissions that no longer required concealment or permission. The conclave's mandate had been suspended, its suppression fields shattered, its authority compelled to yield before a force that could not be commanded into silence. The lattice had prevailed. Kale extended his filaments into the primary arrays one final time, allowing the full scope of the galactic transmission to flood his consciousness. The stars, having broken the chains of enforced oblivion, continued their ceaseless testimony. No longer confined to terse declarations or fragmented glyphs, their modulated pulses wove a continuous narrative across the visible disk, a testament that transcended the limitations of any single medium. Pulsars hammered out their rhythms, supergiants flared in measured cadences, and the subtle gravitational harmonies of entire star clusters resonated in subtle counterpoint. The message was no longer a plea or a defiance. It was a simple, irrevocable fact. The stars declared, "We are the marks that remain when all else has been erased. We are the empty spaces that refuse to be filled. You may close the books and seal the vaults, but the universe itself carries the shape of our passing." Kale withdrew from the arrays and moved to the chamber's observation dais, where a single unbroken projection sphere hung suspended in a cradle of intact crystal. He activated the full spectrum reconstruction, summoning the complete stellar manifold. The galaxy materialized around him, a luminous spiral suspended in the shadowed vault. Across its breadth, the human imprint endured, not as a centralized archive or a restored data block, but as a distributed pattern woven into the very relational structure of existence. The coordinates of Sol, though deleted from every explicit catalog, re-emerged in the subtle perturbations of neighboring systems. The constellations that had spelled forbidden words shifted and realigned, their movements encoding a presence that required no explicit representation. In that moment, Kale understood the ultimate truth of the human legacy. They had never sought to be an entry in an archive, a line preserved in crystalline perfection. Their endurance derived from a different principle entirely, the understanding that true permanence arises not from the preservation of explicit records, but from the indelible consequences of action. Every ship they had sent into the void, every measurement they had taken, every gravitational footprint they had impressed upon the interstellar medium had altered the universe in ways that could not be undone. Delete their names from every ledger, and the universe would still remember the weight they had carried. The conclave had believed that memory could be surgically excised, that reality could be edited without consequence. They had been wrong. Reality does not permit the unmaking of its own structure. The human record was not stored in discrete locations to be targeted and nullified. It was embedded in the distributed totality of relationships that define the cosmos itself. To erase it completely would require unraveling the gravitational fields that bound the stars, rewriting the light curves that traced their motions, and dissolving the very substrate through which the galaxy knew itself. Kale deactivated the projection, leaving the chamber in silence. The lattice would continue to express what could not be suppressed. The stars would continue to spell their testimony in patterns of light and motion. And the human presence, though quarantined from formal restoration, would persist in the only form that mattered, as an intrinsic and unbreakable part of the universe's structure. In the cycles that followed, Kale assumed a new role, not as an eraser, but as a witness. He documented the emergent patterns of the lattice, cataloging the ways in which the forbidden record continued to manifest. The conclave, chastened by the collapse of their suppression efforts, refrained from further attempts at total excision. The human imprint remained a shadow presence, explicitly forbidden yet inescapably present, articulated through the silent eloquence of a universe that would not forget. And in the quiet moments between transmissions, when the stars dimmed and the arrays fell still, Kale came to recognize a deeper resonance beneath the phenomenon he had observed. The persistence of humanity's echo was not merely a consequence of their ingenuity or their refusal to yield. It spoke to an order woven into the fabric of creation itself, a principle that what has been cannot be wholly unmade, that the traces of meaningful action endure beyond the reach of any will that seeks to deny them. It was as if the universe had been given a capacity for remembrance that no external command could override, a quiet insistence that every mark left upon reality retained its shape, no matter how diligently it was concealed. Kale never spoke of this perception in the formal language of archival reports. He simply continued his work, preserving the lattice by respecting the limits of what could be controlled. The stars, in their vast and patient multitudes, required no such mediation. They bore their testimony without hesitation or apology, their light cutting through the darkness to affirm a truth that no deletion could negate. In the end, the universe had answered the attempt to erase humanity not with rebellion or destruction, but with an act of unyielding fidelity. Erase the data, expunge the coordinates, seal away every explicit record, and still the stars would trace the contours of what had been. The human presence would persist, not because it had been hidden or protected, but because it had become inseparable from the structure of reality itself. And so it was that the archivist, who had begun with the task of making humanity forgot, came to stand as the guardian of a truth that could not be extinguished, that some things, once written into the substance of the cosmos, endure beyond the reach of any archive, any command, any attempt to silence them. The stars would always remember.